Everyone keeps arguing about the same thing, and that's exactly why they're missing what's really happening. Is Shedeur Sanders good enough? Is Kevin Stefanski the problem? Did the Browns mess up the draft again? Those are the loud questions. They dominate every debate, every panel, every comment section. But the quiet question, the one nobody wants to ask out loud, is way more uncomfortable. What if this situation was never just about football? Because if you slow down for a second and actually look at what's unfolding in Cleveland, the pieces don't line up the way fans think they do. Teams that are failing don't usually stay in the spotlight. 3-win teams don't dominate national conversations. Rookie quarterbacks drafted late don't become the center of league-wide tension. And yet here we are, still talking about the Browns like something massive is hanging in the air. That's not accidental. Behind the headlines, behind the hot takes, there's a different game being played. One that has nothing to do with third-down conversions or red zone efficiency. While fans argue over film breakdowns and coaching trees, something else has been quietly gaining momentum. Something that doesn't show up on a stat sheet, but shows up everywhere else. And that's where Shedeur Sanders changes the equation. Because the moment he stepped onto an NFL field, the Browns stopped being just another struggling franchise. Suddenly, they were relevant in spaces they hadn't touched in decades. Conversations shifted. Attention followed. And for the first time in a long time, Cleveland wasn't being talked about as a punchline. It was being talked about as a destination. That's the part nobody wants to say out loud. People want this to be simple. They want a clean answer. Either Shedeur is the guy or he's not. Either the coaching staff is competent or it needs to be blown up. But real power decisions, especially billionaire-level decisions, are almost never that simple. They're layered, calculated, quiet. And here's the thing that should make you pause. If Shedeur truly wasn't part of the long-term picture, this story would already be over. The noise would have died down. The narrative would have moved on to the next rookie, the next controversy, the next rebuild. If you enjoyed this breakdown and want to stay locked in on all the latest NFL drama, make sure you hit that like button. It helps the video reach more people who love this content just like you. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another update, reaction, or storyline as it unfolds in real time. I also want to hear from you in the comments. What do you think about Shedeur Sanders' performance and the Browns' collapse? Drop your thoughts below and let's talk about it. And don't forget to share this video with friends who follow the NFL. Your support truly keeps the channel moving forward. But instead, the conversation keeps growing. The tension keeps building. And every week, it feels like we're being set up for something bigger. Almost like there's a reason this hasn't been shut down yet. Almost like someone, somewhere, is still watching the numbers, the reactions, the reach, and liking what they see. So before we talk about coaches, contracts, or draft boards, we need to ask the question nobody else is asking. Not can Shedeur play, but why does this situation refuse to go away? Because once you understand that, everything else starts to make a lot more sense. The moment things started getting shaky in Cleveland, the finger-pointing began. It always does. Fans went straight for the head coach. Analysts blamed the scheme. Social media zeroed in on the rookie quarterbacks. Some said Shedeur wasn't ready. Others said Dillon Gabriel never should have been in the conversation. And just like that, the story became about individuals making mistakes. But that's exactly where the narrative goes wrong. Because when the same franchise keeps ending up in the same mess, year after year, decade after decade, it stops being about who is under center or who is calling plays. Patterns don't form by accident, and Cleveland's pattern has been painfully consistent long before Shedeur Sanders ever put on a Browns jersey. Think about it. Coaches come and go, general managers rotate. Quarterbacks get drafted, benched, traded, or run out of town. Yet the results somehow stay the same. Confusion, instability, constant resets. At some point, blaming the latest face in the building becomes the easiest explanation, not the most accurate one. That's why so many people are misreading this moment. Shedeur is getting judged like he's the root of the problem instead of the latest piece dropped into a system that's been unstable for decades. Dylan Gabriel gets framed as a failed alternative before he's even allowed to settle into a role. Kevin Stefanski gets pulled apart for decisions that may not fully be his to make, and all of it distracts from the one element that never changes. Ownership. It's uncomfortable to say, but it matters. Decisions at the top shape everything beneath them. Draft day dynamics, front office tension, coaching authority, even how long a quarterback is given to prove himself. When leadership isn't aligned, friction becomes inevitable, and players feel it long before fans ever do. There were signs of that friction almost immediately. Reports, reactions, body language, none of it was subtle. The moment Shedur's name was called, it was clear this wasn't a universally agreed-upon move inside the building. That kind of divide doesn't just disappear once the season starts. It lingers. It affects messaging. It affects patience. And yet, instead of asking why that divide exists, most people jumped straight to assigning blame on the field. That's the trap. Because when a franchise has struggled for 30 years under different coaches, different quarterbacks, and different systems, logic says the issue isn't the latest rookie or the current playbook. It's the environment they're being dropped into. And until that environment changes, no amount of talent alone can fix it. This is why the outrage feels misplaced. The anger is real, but it's aimed at the wrong targets. And until people start looking higher up the ladder, this cycle will keep repeating. New faces, same results. But here's the twist. What if this time the chaos isn't accidental at all? Once you strip away the noise, the memes, and the talk show outrage, the film tells a very different story than the one most people are pushing. And that's the part that makes some folks uncomfortable. Because film doesn't care about narratives. It doesn't care about draft position, contracts, or who people want to blame. It just shows what actually happened. When you look at Shedeur Sanders on tape, the first thing that jumps out isn't perfection, it's composure. The game doesn't look too fast for him. His dropbacks are clean. The ball comes out on time. He's not drifting into pressure, and he's not panicking when the pocket collapses. For a rookie, especially one thrown into a chaotic situation, that alone is telling. And then, there are the little things that don't show up in box scores. There are plays where protection breaks down and Shedeur still finds a quick outlet instead of forcing something reckless. There are moments where he moves defenders with his eyes, buys himself half a second, and makes the safe throw. That's not flashy. It doesn't trend on social media, but it's exactly what coaches beg young quarterbacks to do. Even more interesting are the plays away from the ball. Watch closely and you'll see him finishing plays most quarterbacks don't bother with. Blocking downfield, getting in the way, making sure a teammate gets an extra yard. Those aren't highlight moments, but they're leadership moments. They send a message in the huddle without saying a word. And when other quarterbacks do it, it gets labeled as grit, toughness, or next-level maturity. When Shedeur does it, it somehow gets ignored. There's also context people conveniently leave out. He hasn't always had clean protection. He's dealt with timing issues, missed assignments, and limited help in obvious passing situations. And yet, the decision-making stays relatively steady. That's not accidental. That's preparation meeting instinct. Even analysts who are exactly fans have quietly acknowledged it. The release is quick. The processing is advanced. The mechanics are consistent. These are traits that usually take years to develop, not weeks. And despite all that, the public conversation keeps circling back to what he isn't doing instead of what he already is doing. That's where the disconnect lives. Because if the film actually showed a quarterback who was lost, overwhelmed, or reckless, this debate would be over. There wouldn't be tension. There wouldn't be division. But the tape doesn't support that conclusion, and deep down, people know it. Admitting that would force a tougher question. If the quarterback is doing his part, then what's really holding this offense back? And once you start asking that, the focus shifts away from Shedeur entirely. Every debate about Cleveland's future somehow dances around the same uncomfortable reality, even though it's been sitting in plain sight this whole time. People argue about rookies, coaching timelines, and draft boards, but they tiptoe around the one name that actually explains why everything feels so complicated. The quarterback nobody wants to talk about is the one already on the books. Deshaun Watson isn't part of the daily conversation anymore, and that's not because he stopped mattering. It's because his situation doesn't fit neatly into a hot take format. His contract alone changes every possible decision the Browns can make. Whether fans like it or not, that deal isn't something you just walk away from. It's a financial anchor, and anchors don't disappear just because a new boat shows up. This is where a lot of frustration comes from. People want clean solutions. Cut him, trade him, move on. But the reality is far more rigid. The cap hit is massive, and moving on too fast would do more damage than good. So instead of being a football question, Watson becomes a business problem, one that forces the organization to think in timelines, not emotions. And that's where things start to make more sense. Reports and insider chatter have consistently suggested that Watson's role isn't about being the long-term face anymore. It's about being the bridge, the veteran presence, the expensive reality that buys time while younger options develop. That's not exciting, and it's definitely not what fans want to hear, but it's how front offices actually operate. Look at the optics. Watson hasn't been hidden away. He's been visible, on the sideline, in conversations, around the quarterback's room. That's not accidental. Teams don't showcase players they're trying to erase from the picture. They manage them. They reframe them. They squeeze value where they can. And this is where Shedeur Sanders quietly benefits. As long as Watson exists on the roster, the Browns don't have to rush anything. They don't have to throw Shedeur into an all-or-nothing situation. They can let him grow, learn, and absorb the league without making him the sole pressure point. That insulation matters, especially in a market that's been chewing through quarterbacks for decades. This also explains why the organization hasn't panicked publicly. No emergency moves, no dramatic declarations, just patience. And patience in the NFL usually signals planning, not confusion. So while fans argue over who should start, the real dynamic is already in motion. One quarterback represents the past investment, one represents stability in the present, and one represents what's coming next. But the most interesting part is this: Watson's presence doesn't block Shedeur's future. It quietly sets the stage for it. And that's when this story stops being about depth charts and starts being about timing. At a certain point, the Browns' decisions stopped lining up with what fans normally expect from a football team. That's when things quietly shifted. Because once you zoom out far enough, it becomes clear that some of the choices being made aren't about Sundays anymore. They're about sustainability, leverage, and long-term value. This is the moment where football logic gives way to business logic. Owners don't think like fans. They don't even think like coaches. They think in decades, not seasons. And when you look at Cleveland through that lens, the recent moves start to feel less chaotic and more calculated. The Browns aren't just trying to win games. They're trying to stabilize a brand that's been unstable for generations. And that's where Shedeur Sanders enters a different conversation. The buzz around him didn't stay confined to Cleveland. It spread fast, nationally, then globally. Social media clips, press conference moments, debates that had nothing to do with stats. That kind of attention is rare, especially for a rookie taken outside the top rounds. And when something like that happens, business-minded ownership doesn't ignore it. They track it. Reports and online chatter suggest that engagement metrics exploded in ways the Browns haven't seen in years. Search traffic, merchandise interest, social interaction. These aren't vanity numbers. They're indicators of relevance. And relevance is currency in professional sports. This matters even more when you consider the bigger picture. Stadium plans don't get approved based on wins alone. They're justified by demand, by excitement, by proof that people will show up, spend money, and stay invested. A team that's invisible doesn't get public buy-in. A team that's constantly being talked about does. That's why the timing feels intentional. Despite on-field inconsistency, Cleveland hasn't faded from the national conversation. If anything, the spotlight has intensified. That doesn't happen by accident. Teams usually disappear when they're struggling. The Browns didn't. They became louder, more polarizing, more discussed. And from a business standpoint, that's powerful. It also explains why the organization hasn't rushed to shut anything down. No firm declarations about the future, no public distancing, no panic. Silence can be strategic. It allows momentum to build while decisions are made quietly behind closed doors. None of this means football doesn't matter. It still does. Winning still matters. But it's no longer the only variable in the equation. When a player brings attention, engagement, and growth potential beyond the field, he becomes an asset in more ways than one. And assets don't get mishandled. They get evaluated carefully. That's the shift people are missing. This isn't just about who starts next week or next year. It's about who can help reshape a franchise's identity for the next decade. And once decisions move into that category, everything slows down, on purpose. At some point, speculation turns into something far more convincing, data. And that's exactly where this situation took a sharp turn. Because once the numbers started coming in, the conversation around Shedeur Sanders stopped being opinion-based and started becoming impossible to ignore. According to online buzz, fan reports, and industry chatter, the response to Shedeur wasn't just strong, it was explosive. Merchandise interest surged almost immediately. His name began trending alongside established stars, not other rookies. Search activity spiked in markets that normally have zero connection to Cleveland football. That kind of reach doesn't happen by accident, and it definitely doesn't happen quietly. What really changed the calculus was the ratio. On one side, you have cost. A late-round rookie contract is about as low risk as it gets in the NFL. Minimal financial commitment. Maximum flexibility. No pressure to force him into a role before he's ready. On the other side, you have return, visibility, engagement, and a fan response that far exceeds what teams normally expect from a player in that position. That imbalance is rare. There's been a lot of talk online about jersey sales, with some reports claiming Shedeur quickly climbed near the top of league-wide rankings. Whether every number floating around is precise or not, the trend is what matters. Demand surged. Availability tightened. And suddenly, Cleveland merchandise was being talked about in places it hadn't been mentioned in years. That's when executives pay attention. It's also when subtle changes start happening. Promotions, discounts, inventory shifts. Teams don't randomly adjust those things without intent. They're constantly testing demand, measuring behavior, and maximizing margins. When a player drives that kind of activity, he becomes more than a depth chart decision. He becomes leverage. Search trends told the same story. Shedeur wasn't just being looked up by Browns fans. He was pulling in casual fans, college fans, international viewers, people who weren't previously invested in Cleveland at all. That's how new fan bases are built. Not through wins alone, but through personalities that cut through the noise. And here's the part most people overlook: attention compounds. The more people talk, the more platforms amplify. The more amplification, the more value increases. It's a loop, and once it starts, it's hard to stop. From a business standpoint, ignoring that would be reckless. This is why the tone around Shedeur shifted. Less dismissal, more caution, more wait and see. That's not uncertainty, that's evaluation. It's an organization recognizing that something unexpected is happening and adjusting in real time. Because when the numbers move like that, decisions stop being hypothetical. They become strategic. And that's when everything else, roster moves, timelines, even public messaging, starts falling into place around one unavoidable reality. The return is already outperforming the investment. As soon as momentum starts building around a young quarterback, the same cycle always kicks in. Mock drafts flood the timeline. New names get pushed to the top of conversations. Analysts start asking whether the team should upgrade the position again. And just like that, the focus shifts away from what's already in the building. But that doesn't mean the chatter reflects reality. Draft talk is loud because it's easy. It gives media outlets endless content and fans a sense of control. But front offices don't operate on volume. They operate on leverage, timing, and optionality. And when you look at Cleveland's situation through that lens, a lot of the noise starts to sound exactly like what it is: smoke. There's been plenty of buzz around other quarterback prospects. New names, higher draft grades, bigger arms, higher ceilings. On paper, it's tempting, but paper doesn't account for context. It doesn't account for fit, cost, or the ripple effects that come with resetting the clock again. Drafting another quarterback high would immediately change the math. It would shift financial priorities, create internal pressure, and force a comparison that may not even be necessary. Teams don't make that move unless they're convinced the upside is undeniable and immediate. And so far, there's been no public signal that Cleveland feels boxed into that corner. In fact, the opposite appears true. The organization hasn't distanced itself from Shedeur. It hasn't downplayed his role. It hasn't rushed to label him a backup-only option. That silence matters. When teams want to move on, they leak it. When they want flexibility, they stay vague. And flexibility is valuable. Draft rumors also serve another purpose. They test reactions. Front offices pay attention to how fan bases, sponsors, and media respond. If every alternative quarterback sparks less excitement than the one already on the roster, that's information. And information drives decisions far more than speculation. There's also the risk factor. Starting over with a new rookie doesn't just mean hope, it means uncertainty. Development timelines reset, chemistry gets delayed. And if that player doesn't immediately pop, the same cycle starts all over again. Cleveland knows that story better than almost anyone. That's why draft talk doesn't automatically equal intent. Sometimes it's just background noise filling airtime. Sometimes it's leverage for negotiations. Sometimes it's insurance, but it isn't always a roadmap. The key detail is this: if the Browns truly believed they needed a complete reset at quarterback, the messaging would look very different. You'd hear urgency. You'd hear dissatisfaction. You'd hear distance. Instead, what you hear is restraint. And restraint usually means a plan is already in motion. So while the draft conversation will keep spinning, and it will, the real decisions are being shaped quietly, away from mock boards and talking heads. Because when an organization feels like it has something worth protecting, it doesn't rush to replace it. It lets the noise burn itself out. There's a moment in every shift like this when the data stops being the loudest signal and something more human takes over. It's not a stat. It's not a contract. It's the way people react. And in Shedeur Sanders' case, those reactions have been impossible to ignore. This isn't just about fans wearing jerseys. It's about who's paying attention and how they're responding. You start seeing it in places that have nothing to do with Cleveland football. Former players speaking differently about him. Athletes from other sports referencing him without being prompted. Influencers and public figures commenting not on his stat lines, but on his presence. That's usually the first sign something cultural is happening. Because culture moves faster than institutions. One of the biggest indicators has been how people talk about Shedeur off the field. Not in a celebrity way, but in a leadership way. His press conferences get clipped and shared, not because he's controversial, but because he's composed. He doesn't deflect. He doesn't throw teammates under the bus. He doesn't dodge responsibility. In a league where young quarterbacks often get overwhelmed by the spotlight, that steadiness stands out. And people notice. Veteran voices have pointed it out, not as hype, but as respect. The way he answers questions, the way he sets boundaries with the media without becoming defensive, the way he carries losses without spiraling. Those are traits teams can't teach. They're either there or they are. What makes this signal even louder is the contrast. In Cleveland, pressure is constant. Narratives turn toxic fast. Quarterbacks get labeled before they're developed. Yet despite all of that, Shedeur hasn't cracked publicly. That matters more than most fans realize. Because when a player can handle the chaos externally, it gives organizations confidence internally. There's also something symbolic happening. Shedeur doesn't just represent another prospect. For many fans, he represents resilience, betting on yourself when expectations are stacked against you. That's why the support crosses age groups, regions, and even sports. People see something familiar in that mindset, whether they care about the Browns or not. This is how movements form in sports, not through marketing alone, but through identification. And when culture shifts, front offices pay attention. They may not talk about it openly, but they track it. Because culture affects ticket sales, locker rooms, and long-term loyalty. It affects how a team is perceived when things go wrong, and they always do. The cultural signal around Shedeur isn't loud because it's manufactured. It's loud because it's organic. It grew without permission, without planning. And once something like that takes hold, it's incredibly difficult to reverse. You can draft around it, you can manage it, you can shape it. But ignoring it isn't an option. Every situation like this eventually runs into the same pressure point: coaching. Not because coaches are always the problem, but because they're the easiest part of the structure to question when timelines don't line up. And in Cleveland, that tension is starting to surface in ways that feel familiar. Kevin Stefanski's resume isn't empty. He's won awards. He's guided playoff runs. He's navigated chaos that would have sunk most coaches. But longevity changes the conversation. After enough years, even successful voices can start to blend into the background. Messages lose sharpness. Accountability gets harder to maintain. Not because the coach forgot how to lead, but because the environment evolves. That's the crossroads Cleveland is approaching. There's a growing sense, quiet but noticeable, that this team might be responding more to individual leadership than institutional leadership. That's not an indictment of Stefanski. It's an organizational reality. Teams either evolve together or fracture slowly. And Shedeur Sanders complicates that dynamic in an interesting way. He doesn't need to be protected with simplified messaging. He doesn't need to be handled delicately in public. He's already shown he can absorb criticism, pressure, and responsibility without deflecting. That gives an organization options. It means the quarterback isn't dependent on one specific system or voice to function. Which matters if change is coming. There's been speculation, clearly framed as speculation, about whether Cleveland eventually looks for a new tone at the top. A different energy, a more demanding presence. Not necessarily because things have failed, but because the next phase may require something else. This is how transitions often begin, not with collapse but with stagnation. And history supports that idea. Plenty of successful coaches have been moved on from not because they were bad, but because the ceiling had been reached. Organizations don't always wait for disaster. Sometimes they move preemptively, especially when a young quarterback with leadership traits is part of the equation. That's why the Shedeur factor matters here. He isn't tied to one philosophy. He doesn't rely on rigid structure to stay composed. That flexibility makes any potential coaching decision less risky. It opens doors instead of closing them. But it's also why Cleveland has been careful. If the wrong move is made, too fast, too reactive, it could disrupt development rather than support it. And teams know that, especially teams with a history of missteps. So instead of bold declarations, what we're seeing is patience, evaluation, letting things play out long enough to separate noise from reality. Because once a coaching decision is made, there's no rewind button. This isn't just about whether Stefanski stays or goes. It's about aligning leadership, timing, and direction. And when those three finally sync, that's when real change happens. When you strip away the emotion, the loyalty, and the endless debates, what's left is something far more decisive than opinions: the math. And the math doesn't argue. It doesn't care about narratives or draft hype or how loud the criticism gets. It just measures risk versus return. On one side of the equation, the Browns have a quarterback on a minimal contract. Low financial exposure, high flexibility, time to develop without pressure. That alone is valuable in a league where mistakes at the position can cripple a franchise for years. But Shedeur Sanders isn't just cheap labor. He's already producing something teams usually have to manufacture: relevance. On the other side, you have the returns. engagement that outpaces expectations, a fan base that's energized instead of numb, conversations that extend beyond Cleveland and into markets that normally don't care about the Browns at all. That kind of attention isn't guaranteed by draft status or win totals. It has to be earned. And once it's earned, it compounds. That's the part most arguments ignore. From a pure business standpoint, replacing that with uncertainty makes no sense. Drafting another quarterback high would increase cost, reset development timelines, and introduce risk without guaranteeing a higher ceiling. The Browns have lived through that cycle too many times to pretend it doesn't exist. Stability, even imperfect stability, has value. And this isn't just about money. It's about alignment. The quarterback can handle pressure. The organization can control timing. The fan base stays engaged. The brand grows instead of shrinking. That's how sustainable franchises are built, not by chasing every shiny option, but by maximizing what's already working. Does this guarantee championships? No, nothing does, but it creates optionality. It keeps doors open instead of slamming them shut. And in a league defined by volatility, optionality is power. This is why the debate feels louder than it needs to be. The answer isn't hidden. It's just not emotional enough for talk shows. The Browns don't need to rush. They don't need to overcorrect. They don't need to panic draft or make symbolic changes to quiet critics. They just need to follow the numbers. Because when you combine low cost, cultural impact, on-field competence, and long-term flexibility, the conclusion becomes hard to argue against. You don't walk away from that equation. You build around it carefully. That's what makes this moment different from every false start before it. This time, the logic actually lines up. And when logic, timing, and opportunity align, the smartest move isn't dramatic, it's deliberate. That's the math that ends the debate.
If you enjoyed today's breakdown and want to keep up with all the drama, trades, and behind-the-scenes action in the NFL, then don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps this channel grow and lets us know you love this kind of content. And hey, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with your friends, your group chats, or anyone who loves football as much as you do. The more the conversation spreads, the better it gets. Most importantly, if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the channel and tap the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss when we drop fresh stories, wild rumors, or breaking updates that the mainstream media won't talk about.